And then I am pleased to welcome Dr Dulcie Gray, one of our educational psychologists from North Somerset. And I'm going to hand straight over to her so that she can introduce herself and introduce our topic for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to say hi before I start sharing my PowerPoint presentation, because as soon as I do that, I can't see everyone. Hi, my name is Dulcie Gray. As Sarah said, I'm an educational psychologist working in North Somerset. I'm also the lead educational psychologist currently working with the early years team. So I do an awful lot of work with early years settings. But given the number of early years settings that are here this evening, there's probably an awful lot of you that I've never met before. So I'm really grateful that so many people have turned up, and I hope that the training is useful and practical, and gives you a bit of an insight into some of the psychology going on around behaviour. I will share my slides and then we can start the presentation. Sarah, are you able to just give me a heads up as to whether you can see that?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Dulcie, before you start, can I just ask, will you be sharing these with the settings? Will you be allowing them, sending them out?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share the slides. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you.
I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my slides. So at certain points in the presentation, I might stop sharing so that I can temporarily see what everyone is chatting about and then come back to the presentation. So forgive me for slightly clunky technology, but I haven't got two screens, so I'm going to have to work with what I've got. But today we're talking about behaviour as a form of communication. It's a real hot topic, I think, at the moment. Lots of settings that I'm working with are coming up with social, emotional, mental health needs. So that's really why I picked the topic today. And I'm talking about a psychology theory that is one of my favourite theories to talk about. So hopefully everyone thinks the same thing by the end and it's interesting for everyone. I think Sarah's already started doing this already, but just a few online training etiquette things. But if you can keep your mics on mute unless you're trying to speak, just so that everyone can hear. It is a really big group today. I think probably one of the biggest groups I've presented to online. So we'll just keep it quiet so that people can hear. And yeah, if you want to join in or speak, that you're more than welcome to ask questions or join in with chats and discussions. But otherwise, please, can you keep your mic on mute? I do have a few points where I'm going to ask questions, and I would be grateful if you use the chat function and contribute to discussions. I appreciate when it's a big group and it's in the evening, everyone is a bit reluctant to chat, but it does make it so much more interesting to have everyone else talking, not just me, for the whole time. Otherwise, I am going to talk all the way through for the whole hour and a half. So I'm not going to take a break because I'm not 100% sure how long everything's going to take me to get through. And I'd rather make sure we have time at the end for questions. But if you need to break, please, by all means, turn your camera off, put your mic on mute and go and take a break as and when you need. I appreciate you all giving up your evenings to do this training. So do whatever you need to feel comfortable throughout. But bear with me because there is a lot of me talking in today's training. So today what we're going to try and cover is thinking about psychology underpinning children's behaviours. I'm going to focus very specifically on one psychology theory. There are so many we could talk about, but I'm going to use one as sort of an underpinning theory throughout everything I talk about today. And hopefully that helps us understand some of the behaviours that we see when we're working with children, particularly those that present with those SEMH needs. I'm then going to think about what children might be trying to communicate when they show us those behaviours. And then think about what we can do to support some of those children, particularly, like I say, those with social, emotional and mental health difficulties. I mean, in the early years, the mental health aspect is always a bit, it feels like a very heavy terminology, I think, for sort of 3, 4, 5-year-olds. But using the code of practice, that's the language I have used in today's presentation. So hopefully that's what you were expecting today's presentation to cover. And there's no real curveballs, but I have tried to talk about a psychology theory that's a bit more unusual, just so we've got a different perspective and thinking about how we can support children's behaviours. There are a few key principles that are underpinning everything I'm going to talk about today, so they're helpful for everyone to be aware of. The first is the principle around all behaviour being a form of communication. So this is genuinely a principle that I believe is to be true. I think when we see behaviour in any form, children are trying to communicate something to us. They're not necessarily aware that they're trying to communicate something to us, but there's something to be learned from that, and there's something that we can do to understand what's going on for that individual child. So that's sort of an underpinning key assumption that I'm making as part of today's training. The next one is that being fair is not always about everyone getting the same, but it's about everyone getting what they need. So the picture on the screen shows that nicely for me. So the concept that equality is about everyone getting the same thing, whereas equity is about everyone getting what they need, which means for some children who've experienced difficulties in life, or different starts in life, or at a different can't get my words out, or at a different developmental stage in life, they might need additional support to their peers who perhaps are working at a different advantage point. And that way it evens out the playing field and means everyone is getting what they need to be able to access the same level of provision and support. So that's another key assumption I'm making. The third is that relationships are key, particularly when we're working with children who have social, emotional, mental health needs. Relationships are everything. In research, it has been found that 75% of the impact of therapy comes down to the relationship that the therapist has with the person they're working with. And that has now been found to be true for sort of pretty much any intervention or provision that we put in place. So when we talk about putting in strategies, putting in support to help children with SEMH needs, the relationships have to be the foundation skill that we've got. We need to have positive relationships, secure relationships with the children we work with in order to be able to enact change and put in strategies that are impactful for those children. And then the final one is working with families is crucial. I think lots of earlier settings are very aware of this already, but you're often the first port of call for families. Sometimes you're the first professionals they've been exposed to or worked with. You might be the first people to raise that their child is presenting with difficulties. And so working at that family's pace and with that family's timeline is really important. Sometimes in the early years, it's very tricky for families to get their heads around the level of need that their child might be presenting with, or the fact that their child might be finding some aspects of preschool tricky. So working at their pace is really important. I'm not necessarily going to come back to all of these, other than the top one that I come back to quite a lot, but they're underlying assumptions that are key to everything I'm going to speak about today. So I'm going to start with a chat point, so I will stop sharing in a second and hope that people feel brave enough to contribute. But my first question is just what feelings come to mind when you think about the topic of behaviour? It can be feelings that you hold yourself when you think about it in your work and your practice, or it can be feelings that you think the children are experiencing and that come to mind when you think about their experiences. But I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the chat and see what everyone says. Oh, great. People, thank you, Emily, for going first, because it's horrible to go first in these big chats. But yeah, anxiety from the little ones is 100% a feeling that definitely crops up. And anger, Michelle, absolutely. Frustration, both mine and the child's. Yeah, thank you, Kirsty, because I think it's so important to acknowledge that the emotions the child is feeling are very much emotions that we can feel as well. And actually, when you're faced with a child experiencing that difficult emotion, we call it projection in psychology, but sometimes when that person is experiencing something, you can then experience the same emotion back. And it can create this tension and difficulty, especially if you're trying to get things to go right. Different expectations, overwhelmed, confused. Absolutely, all of these emotions are definitely factors at play. I'm guessing no one specified, but I'm guessing for both parties. It can be really confusing and overwhelming when we don't know why that child is presenting with what they're presenting with, but it can also be really overwhelming for the child to have such a big emotion or to be experiencing whatever it is that's triggered that emotion. And for our little ones, quite confusing to have such big feelings. Panic, Judy said panic. Yeah, absolutely. And again, Judy, I'm guessing it could be on both parties. I've definitely had a panic when I've seen an early years child do something when they're presenting with behaviour that makes me worried for safety. I think I very much get an instant panic. And bored, need for attention. Yeah, absolutely. I think that need for attention is something I come back to later in the training as well. It's absolutely 100% a thing. Okay, thank you so much for joining in. I always am grateful when it's big groups, because I recognise it's not very nice to join in a big group, especially when it's an evening and everyone wants to relax. But I'm going to keep going. But thank you so much for your contributions. I think it's just really helpful for us to start by reflecting on some of those emotions, because it's very easy to talk about the psychology and talk about the things that are in place or that we can try out. But the reality is that the emotions in that moment can often be very heightened, and it can be very tricky to enact some of those things when both practitioners and children are experiencing all those feelings. So it's just worth acknowledging that that's what's taking place in that instance. But we can think a little bit about why some of those feelings are coming up and what the psychology is. Like I said right at the very start, I'm going to talk about a psychology theory that's slightly less common, but there are so many theories that we could talk about when we think about SEMH needs and behaviour. I know lots of settings are aware of some of those already. And so I've tried to go for one that's a little bit different, and that is my favourite for understanding psychology and understanding behaviour. The reason it's my favourite theory is because I think it really gives a great understanding of the whole picture of what's going on surrounding the child. So not just what's going on for that individual child, but the whole picture of all aspects of that child's life and how those factors can interplay and impact on their behaviour, on their emotional well-being, and on their presentation throughout the day in preschool and at home. So the theory I'm going to talk about is resiliency theory. And I will explain a little bit more about what that means. So resilience as a concept is really the idea of being able to bounce back from difficulties or challenges when we face them. It can be defined as being the skill that a person has to recover when something goes wrong or a challenge is experienced in their life, and to then not only recover from it, but to be able to move forward and continue with whatever life throws at you. It has previously been thought that resilience was just a skill some people had and some people didn't have. But actually research has developed more and more as the years have gone on, and we've been able to understand a lot more about resilience, and why some people have it and some people don't. So the theory dates all the way back to the 1970s, when a really interesting piece of research came out that found, well, researchers were looking at children who experienced adversity in their early childhood years and trauma. So it was really children who've had quite a tricky start to life. And what they found is, for the majority of children, when you're experiencing trauma or adverse circumstances, it will impact negatively on emotional well-being, on social skills, on academic attainment and learning. It can impact on all aspects of children's lives. But there was this group of children who just thrived and were able to succeed and be really successful despite all the challenges they were facing. And it's these children that have been the basis of resilience theory. So one of the original researchers coined the term ordinary magic, which I just love that term. I think it's so nice, because the concept of resiliency is something that's exposed to children in their everyday lives. Some children, it's just normal life. They just have this ability to do this magical thing and bounce back no matter what they're facing and what difficulties they've experienced. And so what resilience theory has become to develop is an exploration and an understanding of how we can create that ordinary magic for all the children we're working with. And that's not just necessarily the children who've got SEMH needs, it can be all the children. But it helps us to understand how we can add additional support for those children who need it. And the outcome has been that research is now showing that children who receive support to develop their resilience have positive outcomes socially, emotionally, and academically. So it's impacting across all areas of their life. So it's huge, really. And the difference it can make when we have that early intervention support is amazing. So that's why I like the theory, because I think it has a real tangible chance of actually having a positive impact for children. So we sometimes talk about theories like attachment, or we talk about the impact of adverse childhood experiences. Sometimes the term is used as ACEs to describe those adverse experiences. But it doesn't always tell us what we do to improve those life circumstances for children, whereas resilience theory helps us to think about how we can understand what's happening in the here and now and improve those circumstances for that child. So as research has developed and grown under the sort of concept of resilience theory, researchers have come up with this framework of risk and protective factors. So what we've learned is that there are some factors that create an increased risk for children's development, progress, and sort of resilience in life. And there are also protective factors that help children to succeed and thrive no matter what they're experiencing in life. And really, you can think of it like weighing scales. What we want is more protective factors in place than risk factors. And the children that have more protective factors are more likely to succeed even when they're faced with challenges. So they're the children that have that ordinary magic. They're the children that are able to bounce back from challenge or adversity. But as with everything, some children will have greater risk factors and some children will have greater protective factors in place. And some don't work nice and evenly. So we can't say, oh, if you have 2 risk factors and 4 protective factors, you'll be fine, because some risk factors have greater impact on children's overall well-being, whereas some protective factors similarly have much greater impact on supporting children's resilience and development. But the framework that's on the screen highlights just a few of those risk and protective factors. There are actually so many more that we can look at. I've just tried to pick out some of the ones that I've seen quite commonly present in sort of some walks of life. And the nice thing about this framework is it breaks it down into different aspects of that child's life. So there are factors that are within the child, within the family, within the education setting or early years providing setting, and then within the community. So you can think about all different areas where that child might be exposed to risks and protective factors. So if we work through some of these, the within child factors that we can see at play, the risk factors tend to be in the early years around sort of learning or play difficulties. So those children who are a bit delayed in their play skills, communication or language difficulties, or children who experience global developmental delays in some areas of their sort of growing up and presentation and development. They are just a few, but that gives you a flavour of some of those risk factors. Similarly, the protective factors that are within the child are really around personality characteristics. So being sociable, having a good sense of humour. Those children who have quite a naturally calm temperament, they all act as protective factors. The one different one there is experiences of success. So that's a protective factor that we can actually enaction and put in place for children. But children who experience more success in life are more likely to have the resilience to keep going when they're faced with challenge. Within the family, probably not many surprises here, but the risk factors include things like family breakdown, inconsistent boundaries, parental mental health difficulties, any parental drug use or parental incarceration, are all factors that place risk for the child. And And some of those are very common. So we see family breakdowns, divorce, parental separation really commonly. Parental incarceration or drug use are probably a lot less frequent, but they do happen. And then the protective factors within the family. So having a stable, consistent parent. It only needs to be one stable, consistent parent, but if that is in place, it will act as a protective factor for that child. Having affection and love and being shown that love and affection at home, having someone that takes the time to listen to that child, to sit with them, to spend time playing with them, share their interests, all those things are protective factors. And then having consistent boundaries at home. I would say consistent boundaries is quite a key one that sometimes crops up. It doesn't feel like necessarily a big deal, but it can be really important in helping children to feel safe and secure in their development. In the education sector, things like relationships, as I mentioned right at the start, relationships are key, but they can be a risk factor if they're not in place for the child. So that can be lack of relationships with staff, or it can be difficult or no relationships with peers. So either the sort of child that's falling out with their peers all the time, or isn't able to form reciprocal relationships, or has just no social interest, that can be a risk factor. Discrimination is hopefully less common in earlier settings, but it's there just in case. We do sometimes see sort of unintentional discrimination, and I'm not saying I've seen it in any of the earlier settings in North Somerset, but it does sometimes crop up in schools, where we sometimes inadvertently, schools might sort of display a sort of preference to some children over other children, or perhaps don't necessarily think about the impact of some aspects of that child's life, and how that might be at play for them. But so it's just to be aware, but it's not necessarily something I'm saying we see a lot of. And the protective factors that can be in place, friendships, having a sense of belonging in their preschool or nursery community, and having positive relationships with staff. Staff can offer some of that affection and love and consistent relationships, consistent boundaries that the family can provide as well. So there is lots to be gained from those relationships with adults in settings. And I will talk more about those protective factors that we can put in place as I go through the rest of this training session. And then the other areas to think about are within the community. So families that come from low socioeconomic status are at greater risk of children developing sort of difficulties with their emotional well-being. Families that have experienced discrimination, again, not saying that I've experienced a huge amount of that in North Somerset, but it's just to be aware that those sort of unintentional biases can exist. And then families who've experienced natural disasters or war. They feel very big for the United Kingdom, but we have had quite an influx of refugee families into North Somerset. So there is sort of some families coming in who have experienced quite a lot of challenge in their home country. And so we may see some children present who've had those risk factors at place. But there are lots of protective factors within the community too. So having a wide support network for the family, good housing, and a range of leisure activities. So children who have been to swimming lessons or been to the beach or go to the park, all those things help to act as protective factors, because it's giving them those life experiences that help children be able to navigate the world. So that's a really quick overview of a big theory, but I will keep coming back to it throughout the presentation. I'm going to come back to you all and make you join in with more chat and ask if you can think about a child that you work with currently or that you've worked with previously who displays a high level of behaviour. Can you think about any of the risk factors that might have been in place for that child? And that can be within the child, within the home, within the setting, or sort of within the wider community, any areas, but what risk factors have been at play. I'm going to stop sharing again just so I can see the chat. breakdown of family, a sibling who struggles with additional needs. Yes, sibling is a great idea that I hadn't actually considered when I was putting the presentation together, but you're right. The impact of siblings is huge sometimes. Inconsistent parenting, parental splitting up, having two homes. Yeah, COVID, another one that I didn't address in my presentation, but absolutely massive. No obvious affection, inconsistent boundaries, absolutely. I used to work with a preschool setting, and I worked with a child in there. They came out of their setting. It wasn't in North Somerset, and the child was like, "Oh, I got star of the day," and they were so proud. And the parent said, "Oh, don't be such a nerd." And I thought, oh, it's so heartbreaking for a child that was just so excited about a little reward. So there's those sorts of moments where you think, oh, maybe that affection isn't at play. Parental mental health, housing situation, sleep, food, communication difficulties, absolutely. Inconsistent childcare, absolutely. There's so many factors that can be at play. I think in the early years, like language and communication needs can be huge because children are still learning all of those skills, and everyone's at a different stage. It can impact their relationships with peers. It can impact their sort of access to play. It can impact so many things. Yeah, super. Thank you so much for joining in and contributing. I will go back to my presentation. But it is really interesting, and I think it helps to relate it to the children that we actually know and that we're actually working with. So it gives the theory a bit more context. And I will keep bringing it back to real children that we can think about, because I do find it helpful. Otherwise, these things can feel a little bit abstract. But that's the sort of risk factors at play. And I'm going to move on a little bit to talking about, actually, now we've thought about the theory, what does that mean for children's behaviour? So what we do know is children who experience greater risk factors, who have higher levels of trauma or adversity in their childhood, particularly in their early years, because that's such a foundational stage of life and development. What we do know is that they can experience more difficulties with their emotional regulation. They can experience a greater need to seek adult attention or to seek adult affection, or they can be very untrusting of adults. They might not have had the positive experiences that we would hope in their early childhood, so they're trying to push away from that, and that can present as behaviour. They can also often present with a need to hold some control. So holding control comes from a sense of keep trying to establish a sense of safety. And adults do it too. It's not just children, and it's definitely not just our early years children. But when we are finding ourselves out of our depth or in a situation that makes us feel uncomfortable or unsafe, having control helps us to work out what's going to happen next. If we've got control of the situation, it's predictable, we have choices, we have say on what's going to happen next. And when we feel like that's taken away from us, it can be really scary, particularly if children don't have trust in their adult relationships, they don't have security in their environment, they don't have the skills necessary to be able to communicate what's going on around them or how they're feeling. All those things make it so much more difficult to release that control and feel comfortable and safe in a new environment. And it's those reasons that we start to see behaviour creeping in. And as I said right at the start, the way I'm approaching this whole training is with that philosophy that behaviour is a form of communication. So the picture that we see might be a picture you're all familiar with already, because I've seen it several times before in training. But this idea that behaviour is just the tip of the iceberg. What we see is a very physical reaction very often, but it might be that a child is showing challenging behaviours, they're hitting out or kicking or biting, or it could be the reverse and they're becoming very withdrawn, they're becoming very upset. They might be children who are very clingy and don't want to leave mum or don't want to leave the adults in your setting. Either way, it's all behaviour and it's all trying to tell us something that's going on in that child's world. And 90% of it we can't see. So we're having to work out based on what we know. And that's where sometimes weighing up those risk factors and protective factors for that individual child can help, because we can think about actually what's going on in that child's world that might be at play that's impacting how they're presenting in our settings. And as you can see in the picture, there's 101 things that you could be considering. Children who've got social skills difficulties might be presenting with behaviour because they want to interact but don't know how, or they don't want to interact but are feeling overwhelmed by how many children are in their space. Children might be seeking attention because they need that connection from adults, they need that reassurance, they need that security, or they may be pushing away from all of that and they may be untrusting of adults. So they're presenting with behaviour because they're not feeling safe in that setting. They're not feeling reassured by adult support because they've not had that experience that adults can be trustworthy. And that's no reflection on staff in settings. That's just perhaps a reflection on that child's experiences and the risk factors that they've had at play in their life so far. So that's sort of the things that we need to be thinking about when children present with those behaviours in our settings. But it can also be helpful to think about what cycle we're seeing and what's actually happening for that child when that emotion is happening. What's happening in that moment when we see those big peaks of big emotions. And it is worthwhile, I think, remembering that in those moments, there's all kinds of biological things taking place that mean the child is not necessarily making a controlled choice. They're not deciding what to do. They're not usually acting with thought. They are acting based on impulse. They're acting based on emotion, based on hormones, based on adrenaline, and often that fight, flight, freeze response that we often talk about when we're working with children. But this is the escalation cycle, or escalation peak, that gives us that idea of what's going on in that child's body. So we can start very calm, something can trigger a response, and then all those emotions, those hormones, those adrenaline kicks in, and we see that peak of emotion. And I'll be really honest and say, in reality, it doesn't always look like a nice curve like this. Sometimes it can look like calm and then peak straight away. And those middle points between the trigger and the acceleration, they seem to disappear into nothing. But often that's because of those underlying unknown reasons. So the things we can't see, those underneath the tip of the iceberg things, that can be the reason why we sometimes see 0 to 100 for children. There are sometimes underlying factors that we don't know that are going on. It can also be that there can be a build-up of factors that have happened throughout that child's day that we haven't necessarily seen. I once worked with an older young person, so he was 10, and I asked him why he goes from 0 to 100, and he said, what you can't see is that throughout my morning, 5 other things have happened that have made me feel really stressed or really overwhelmed, and he's been trying to keep that down all that day, and then the final tip of the iceberg thing is the thing that creates the peak. And our early years children don't necessarily have the language to be able to articulate that that's what's happening for them, but it could be a similar thing. So whilst it can look like a lovely peak and a lovely cycle, in practice sometimes it's a little bit messier than that. But what we do know is that when children go into that sort of fight, flight, freeze response, and all those emotions and adrenaline kicks in, and they hit that peak of the escalation cycle, they are actually running on coping strategies. Their body is hitting into a place of trying to keep themselves safe. They're trying to sort of use those caveman strategies of how do I make sure I'm safe in my environment. And they are not able to engage in lovely, practical, reflective conversations. So at that point, we just have to try and bring them down and think about calming. And it's only once we've passed the recovery stage can we have those reflective conversations and really think about what was going on there for that child. In that emotional moment, we just need to think about how we get them back from where they are to a nice calm level. in the very peak of it, children are not going to be able to hear when you say, oh, we can't do that, that's unkind, because they're just reacting to an emotion. So it's bring them down to a nice calm level and then have those conversations. Obviously, we need to act with safety in mind. So if there is something that's unsafe happening, we need to react to protect children and keep everyone safe. But otherwise, it's all about calming in those moments before we can have those nice reflective conversations. I'm not going to dwell too much on this escalation cycle, but I do think it's helpful for us to just reflect and think, oh yes, remember that's what's going on. And sometimes the way I find it helpful is to think about it in myself as well, because these emotions exist in all of us. It's just sometimes in early years children, they haven't learned the skills to regulate yet. So we see much bigger behaviours than we would perhaps see in adults. But if you ever think about yourself getting to a point where you're feeling really angry, and then a family member or a partner comes up and says, oh, have you tried, I don't know, doing some deep breathing or something at that point? It can be extremely frustrating, and often people respond with argumentative behaviours or ignoring the response or being unable to engage in the helpful strategy because you're at that sort of peak point. So instead, you need to come to a place where you're bringing that sort of stress level back down, and then you can re-engage in sort of some of those practical approaches. So it is sometimes helpful to think about it in your own emotional well-being and in your own emotions, because that way it makes more sense, I think, when we think about it for children, because it is all the exact same bodily responses that we're experiencing. So that's what's going on when we experience the emotion. But we also need to think about what we do and how we explore that and how we understand what that behaviour is trying to communicate to us. And sometimes it's lovely and simple and we can identify it straight away. So the example on the slide, that sometimes it's really clear someone took their toy, they got upset, and that creates a big emotional response. And that's a really typical emotional response for their age and stage. But for some children, it's more tricky, and those triggers are less obvious, and we need to use tools to sometimes explore the function of behaviour. So there are things like the ABC charts that lots of people already use in settings where we're looking at trying to identify what the trigger is for the behaviour, what the behaviour actually is, and then what the consequence of that is for that child. But even then, in those moments when we're using charts like that to explore what's going on, sometimes identifying those triggers is really tricky. They can be very difficult to see, and sometimes I would say almost impossible to see. We don't know if children are very tired or very hungry. Sometimes those sorts of things are difficult to explore. And it's in those moments that I would encourage settings to go back to those risk factors, to think about those underlying principles that are at play for that child, and then try and link that back to the behaviour that you're seeing. So, for example, if we know a risk factor for a child is that they have social skills difficulties or language difficulties, and the behaviour that we've seen is that they've hit out at a child for seemingly no reason, it's perhaps worth wondering or exploring the possibility that that child is trying to initiate an interaction or communicate in some way to that child, but doesn't know how. And exploring it in that way can sometimes then help to think about what we can put in place to reduce some of those behaviours. So that's how we can link that theory to some of the practical things we're doing in settings to understand behaviours. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but I do think it's worth mentioning that all of this needs to be in consideration of the age and stage of development that children are at. And these are just a brief overview of ages and stages. And I am very aware that children develop at all different ages, and that these are quite arbitrary numbers, but it just gives us a bit of a framework of where we can expect children to be with their emotional development. So in our tiny babies, our 0 to 12 months, children have no awareness of emotions. What they're responding to is bodily responses, hunger, tiredness. They might seek comfort from adults. They might enjoy affection. They might enjoy that positive feedback, but they are very much responding to the current situation that they're in and their own sort of experiences. They're not really aware of happy or sad and those emotions that might be going on. At 1 year old, and in that first year, we are seeing progress and development in terms of emotional responses, but they can be very unpredictable in children of that age. So you can see children laugh at one situation, and then the next time they're presented with the same situation, they might cry. So they're still coming to terms with emotions. They're developing that understanding. And at 1 year old, children are not yet aware that they are an individual person separate from everyone around them. So they're still sort of trying to grapple with everything that's going on in the world. By 2 years old, children are able to express feelings and will have a bit more of a consistent response to situations. And that consistent response will align with typical expectations. So they will cry in moments where we would expect them to feel sad, and they'll laugh in moments where adults expect them to feel joy. And they're starting to recognize that other people also have feelings, and those feelings might be different to their own. But again, it's all very early stages. By 3, children are developing their independence. They're becoming aware of what's right and wrong, and they want to behave well. They want to fit in preschools and nurseries, but they're battling with that idea of also wanting what they feel is right or getting their own way. So they're at that stage where they're sort of trying to assert themselves a little bit, whilst also trying to do all the right things. And by 4 years old, we would expect most children to have an understanding of emotions and be responding very consistently. And by 4 years old, children are able to sort of participate in some of those conversations, reflections, and negotiations around their emotional responses. As I say, always once they're calm again, but that is the age that we start to expect that awareness to develop. And then by 5, children are starting to develop more independence and ability to self-control and self-regulate some of those emotions. They're also a little bit more likely to be argumentative or try and negotiate with parents because they're learning to assert themselves a little bit more. But it is worth bearing in mind those ages and stages of development, because whilst everyone might develop at different points, what we don't expect is that sort of a 2, 3, even 4-year-old is able to really have a full comprehensive understanding of emotional regulation. So all the children we're working with in the early years, we expect to need support to be able to regulate their emotions. And that's worth bearing in mind. So while some might be more controlled in their emotions, it's absolutely okay that some other children need support with those skills. Right. So now I'm going to think a bit more about how we respond to that behaviour, and I'm going to go back to those psychology theories and think about how we can implement that to action change for the young people we're working with. And I think it's worth emphasising right now that the focus of using this framework isn't necessarily about coming up with the most inventive or creative or unique strategies, but it's actually about making bespoke strategies that meet that individual child's needs. So they might be things we've tried before, they might be things we're really familiar with, but how do we adapt it to make sure it's right for each individual child? So that's what we're going to talk about and think about. And I'm going to use a framework. I love a framework. I think it really helps guide all my thinking. So I hope it helps guide everyone else's thinking. So this is the resilience ball framework. It's taking that concept of resilience theory, and it's thinking about those children who have got greater risk factors and not enough protective factors in place. And the theory breaks it down for us. So rather than just having to try and work out where to start with all those protective factors, because many of which staff working in settings or working with young people don't have the capacity to change. We can't change family circumstances, we can't change community experiences, and we can't always change what's going on for that individual child. What we can change is how we react as adults and how we respond in those situations. And what we know is often how adults react and respond does then impact how children act and respond. So the two go hand in hand. And there are lots of things that we can do to put in place to create more protective factors for children. So this theory or this framework breaks it down into 4 sections, which is nice and manageable. And you can work through each one and work out where the child has gaps, which areas they don't have protective factors, and then they will be the areas that you focus on developing. So I'm going to talk through each one and explain a little bit about what that might look like for each child. So the first step in this process is mastery. Doesn't really matter what order you go in, but I'm starting with mastery. The concept of mastery is really the idea of having some sense of autonomy or control over your life. For our tiny preschoolers, for our early years children, we are not expecting them to have full control, of course, over all aspects of their life, but it's finding ways for them to have a sense of purpose, sense of meaningful, and a sense of autonomy in the things that are important to them. And having this in children's lives and making sure we're prioritizing it helps to develop those protective factors. So it's particularly important that we think about making sure it's in place for children who have a greater number of risk factors, but it is useful for all our children. And it's often an area that I would focus on as a priority if children are seeking a lot of control. And all these things, there's nothing new here, but it's about working out what's going to be right for each child. So providing choices, listening to their views and actually acting upon them. So it's tricky, I think, with little ones because they can share views and it's hard to know how to act upon them. But if they share something that's meaningful to them, really try and sort of listen and use that as much as possible. If children are reluctant to give up control, try using indirect approaches that help give them that sense of safety and sense of control in a way that also allows you as the adults to be able to sort of provide a bit of a framework, a bit of boundaries. So using competitions, games, asking the child to help you out, those sorts of things, building on the child's strengths, the idea that every child should experience success every day. And as we said right at the start, experiencing success regularly is a really good protective factor. And providing praise in a way that is meaningful to the child. So not all children find verbal praise meaningful. Sometimes they need tangible rewards. Sometimes they need sort of physical affection, hugs, like high fives. And sometimes children find it very difficult to accept praise. And using indirect approaches like talking to their parents very positively and openly whilst the child is in earshot is really helpful. So it's working out what's right for that child. But the idea of all these approaches and any more you can think of that sit within this category is about trying to give that child a sense of control within an environment that's safe and within an environment that's protected so that they're able to sort of explore that autonomy in a way that's supervised and manageable for their developmental level. So that's our first step. The next one is about providing meaning. So giving children a sense of meaning and purpose in everything they do, or in as much as we can in what they do. And meaning will vary a lot for each individual child. But a lot of what we're looking at is perhaps sharing interests or having a feeling that other people share interests with them, feeling that other people are coming into their level and sharing what's important to them and that they're able to express what's important to them or participate in something that's meaningful to them. And for children in the early years, that can look like very small things. Lots of children love having a job or a responsibility. Lots of children will want to share what's interesting to them. But some children also might not know yet what's interesting to them. They might not know what their interests are or what motivates them. Or as adults, we might not know what interests them and motivates them. So maybe for that child, understanding their meaning is just about exploring those areas and trying to find things that act as motivators, that act as areas of interest. Then we can think about how we can provide that child with opportunities to share those interests, whether it be with another adult or other children, and to celebrate those interests. So that whether that's through wall displays, sometimes being able to put up things on their wall displays, or being able to verbally share those things. But if children are not verbally able, lots of children are very able to use technology these days, so whether they can take photographs of what's important to them and show you things, or bring in things from home, whatever it is, it's just trying to give that child a chance to have a sense of meaning and purpose in their sort of setting environment. And lots of these things could be done as a one-off, but what it needs to be really is a really regular, consistent opportunity for children to feel like they're part of something, and develop that sense of belonging in their settings, and all that can contribute to creating a protective factor for that child. The next one is bonding. So again, I said I'd go back to relationships over and over, but they are so powerful and important, particularly for our children who've experienced SEMH needs. And those children with those higher risk factors need more bonding experiences than perhaps some of our others. They are also probably the children that are most likely to push away from those bonding experiences, whether that be that they don't have the attention to sit and focus, or because they present with quite challenging behaviours that makes it very difficult to have those positive moments of affection. But where possible, it is really important to try and factor those times in, because creating those relationships is so important in helping children to develop resilience, to develop their emotional regulation skills, and to develop their emotional well-being. So having close relationships with adults that allow them to feel loved and cared for is really important. Being really consistent in our response is really key. So if we're working in a setting environment where there's several adults, is trying to make sure we are consistent in our response when everyone is interacting with that child. And I absolutely believe that having lots of adults is really key. I'm not suggesting that we do only one adult interacting with that child throughout the day to make sure it's consistent, but just about trying to make sure the way we all react is very similar. And that really helps to create that sense of safety for children and their sense of trust in the relationship that they've got. It's particularly important for children who don't have that consistency at home. Friendships is also really important to developing resilience. So if there are things that we can do to foster friendships and build relationships with peers, that's another factor that's really key. And then for some children, if they are very resistant to adult support or very much seeking adult support throughout their day, and that can look like behaviour. So sometimes children will present with big behaviours to get a reaction. And when we think children are doing that, sometimes it can be helpful to have a consistent time of day that is always in place, sort of like a special time where that child can do something related to their interests, sharing a positive experience with an adult, so that they start to trust that that relationship will always be in place. And it, as much as possible, that needs to be very consistent time of day, consistent person. It needs to always be in place. And if it's not in place for some reason, it needs to be explained to the child why it's not happening, give them warning that it might not happen, and if possible, give them an alternative adult who can sort of still provide them with that time. But giving them that reassurance that actually adults are there for them, and it just is giving children that teaching that we can provide them with the support and the nurture and the love that they need. So that's bonding, and that's our next resilience factor that we can pop in place for children. And then the final one is skills. I often think when I'm working with children, it's very easy to jump to skills as our priority. It's often the one that I jump to too. So I'm not saying that's anyone else's approach. Maybe it's just mine, but I find it's very easy to go to the thing that the child needs to develop rather than thinking about all the other things that are perhaps the things we need to work on as adults. But in terms of skills, sometimes there are particular things that we need to be supporting children to develop, and we need to place increased emphasis on to help children progress and learn. So that could be social skills, it could be emotional regulation skills or emotional literacy skills, so the ability to be able to communicate what they're feeling. It could be any number of things. It might be language skills if children have got a language delay, or it could be play skills if children are finding that harder. So it's any number of things that are in place for children. But what I would emphasize is, whilst this is definitely an area of priority and absolutely something that can be really protective for children because it helps them to feel successful and it gives them the chance to develop and grow, all of which works as those protective factors, it's also just worth emphasizing that all the other three areas should not be ignored, that actually we should try and do all four of these things all at once for that child. And that developing children's skills isn't the only thing we need to be working on. But when you are coming up with strategies for supporting children's skills, and I'm not going to list them all because honestly, we could be here for hours because of the number of skills we might be trying to teach. What I would say is just try as much as possible to be creative and have fun with it. The best interventions are the interventions where the child is having a good time and the adult is having a good time. If you're having a positive experience, you're much more likely to take on board learning, to take on board the interactions, and to sort of want to do it again and to respond to it again. So as much as possible, be creative, make it fun, use the child's interests or strengths and build on those areas first. So if the child has particular things that they are really good at within that area that we're trying to develop, then use those as your start point and build from there. I'm trying to think of a really good example, but if, for example, children are trying to develop social skills, and that's the skill we want to focus on, and they're very good independently building with construction material, start with that and build their social skills around their strength. Maybe an adult starts turn taking with them during that construction play, or another child comes and sits alongside them during that construction play, and we just narrate what's going on to help them become aware of the other child. Or we use social stories to explain what's going on in that play and how we can make that more collaborative. Whatever it is for that child, we can sort of explore and think about. It's just about being creative and having fun when we're trying to develop those skills, and hopefully then the children have fun as well. I have put in at the end of the slides a couple of different links that help think about some of those skills we might want to develop and some areas or sort of resources we can use to support some of those developments of some of those skills. But really, that's my key message. Try and keep it light and fun. And short and regular would be my other things. It's better to do interventions, especially for our earliest children, in really short bursts and regularly, than it is to do a one-off once a week and try and make them sit for sort of 20 minutes, because that's tricky for lots of children of that age anyway. So if you can do 5 or 10 minutes and you're doing it a few times a week, it will have a greater impact over time. So they're my key messages when we're thinking about developing skills. I'm going to pause talking and hand over to everyone else for a small breather, and ask if you're thinking about those 4 areas. So I'll recap them. Just mastery, which is about developing that sense of autonomy or having a sense of control in our environment or in the things around us. meaning, so having a sense of purpose in what we do. So for children of the early years, that's often around sort of being able to share our interests, celebrate our interests, and have a focus point on that. The third one is bonding and building relationships, and the fourth one is skills. So if you think about those 4 areas, are there any strategies that come to mind that could help when you're working with children currently in your setting or who currently present with SEMH needs? And I'm going to stop sharing again so I can see the chat. Yeah, absolutely. Using a calm down box of resources. I'm going to talk about the calm down box in a second. So absolutely something I think is important. We find choices that can work. Yeah, Ashley, absolutely. I often say give 2 choices based on what you want. So both outcomes are outcomes you're happy for the child to pick from. And then you just go with those and pick your battles. Honouring their feelings, absolutely. Yeah. Really important to validate those feelings that children are having, even when perhaps the emotion feels a bit over the top or out of context for us. Using now and next, so they know what's coming next. Absolutely, that really helps to create that sense of control in our environments. If children know what's predictable. Currently using TheraPlay, amazing. I've never actually used TheraPlay myself, so I'd be really interested, Judy, to know how that is going. Giving them responsibilities such as helping grown-ups. Yeah, children love responsibilities, don't they? I never know why it's so impactful, but they love having a job. I won't make you keep going, but I do really appreciate the contributions, and please do reflect on it and have a think, because like I say, it's not necessarily about coming up with brand new ideas and theories or strategies that we've never done before, but it's more about thinking about that child's profile, so where their risk factors are, where their protective factors are, and where their gaps are within those things. And so the strategies that we're putting in place are thought through and bespoke based on where those children need that support. Ashley's put consistency and expectation, which absolutely is another factor in time, and a timeline. Yeah, all fantastic strategies. By all means, keep sharing them. I just can no longer see the chat because I've gone back to sharing my screen. But it's helpful for everyone, I think, to sort of share ideas with everyone in the group. So many of you here today. I can imagine there's 101 ideas that we can come up with. But I'm going to keep talking. And my final section of this presentation is how to respond when we're actually faced with the behaviour. So I think it's all well and good thinking about the theories and thinking about the experiences in principle. It's lovely to try and put in those protective factors, and those protective factors will hopefully have long-term impacts. We can often see really long-term impacts for protective factors being in place. Probably not ideal for early years settings, but because a lot of them will take place in primary school and in secondary school. But what you're doing is putting in those foundational skills that helps them to be resilient throughout their educational careers. But it doesn't help necessarily in the moment when we're at the peak of that curve and we're having to deal with the behaviour in the here and now. So I'm going to talk through a few approaches that I always recommend in those moments and how we can make them bespoke to the children we work with. So the first is emotion coaching. I recommend it all the time. I write it into lots of my EHCP advices. I suggest that all schools, preschools, nurseries, secondary schools have training in emotion coaching. I think it's a really fantastic approach. So I'm going to talk about it today. And lots of settings use it or use the principles of it already. So you might be familiar with some of it. But I always think it's really good to revisit and especially remember why it's important. So we've sort of spoken about the importance of clear and consistent boundaries by all adults, but the principles also focus around having caring and nurturing response and trying to remember that all behaviour is a form of communication. But the other key principle of emotion coaching is to recognize that those emotional responses can be a moment, opportunity for teaching and learning. So as much as they can be very stressful, frustrating and difficult for us as adults to navigate, they can also be really powerful moments where children are able to learn and develop and grow. And we can really capitalize on those by using approaches such as emotion coaching. And I'm going to do a really clear caveat and say I'm under no illusion that emotion coaching is going to instantly fix and resolve all our problems. I have, and I promise I have, in real life, used this approach with genuine children who are in their early years, and it took months for it to really embed and for it to really have a positive impact. But I did really feel like it had that impact over time. So it's a matter of persistence. The thing that I find really helpful about emotion coaching is it gives adults a framework of how to respond. So when we're faced with those big behaviours, we have a script and a response that is easy for us to produce and navigate, so that we know that we're doing the right things and that we're supporting children in those moments. So emotion coaching has a really big evidence base to it. The evidence base for emotion coaching, so the research behind it, suggests that when we use it consistently, it helps children not only to develop their emotional regulation skills, but it also develops resilience. It can also have a positive impact on their relationships, and it can have an impact on their overall academic attainment. So it's amazing, the long-lasting impacts of this approach. And the concept is really that you're developing emotional regulation skills through relationships. The idea is that trusted adults make that connection with the child, and they use that trusted relationship to help them feel safe and calm. What we know when children are presenting with those big behaviours is they're often trying to communicate that they're not feeling okay, they're not feeling safe, they're not feeling secure, they might be feeling overwhelmed, frustrated or stressed. But what they're communicating to us is they're not okay right now. And that in those moments, we can use that understanding and to those trusted relationships to try and help bring them back down. And over time, emotion coaching can strengthen relationships, and it can help children to have an even more positive relationship with the adults that work with them. And the idea, I guess, for adults is that we shouldn't be connecting we should be connecting with the child's emotion, but being non-judgmental about the reason behind the emotion. So particularly for our early years children, as we sort of spoke about earlier with those ages and stages of development, emotional responses can be inconsistent. They can sometimes be quite big for what we would expect in that moment, but children haven't learnt the skills yet to regulate or to self-control in moments of emotion. So sometimes the reactions are very big because they don't know yet how to navigate those feelings when they crop up, and they don't always even know what the feeling is that they're experiencing. So that's where emotion coaching can help us out. And it's really simple. It's 5 steps. So the first step is becoming aware of the child's emotions. So all you have to do is be aware that the child is experiencing an emotion. And when we see those behaviours, rather than seeing it as, oh no, this child's hitting again, or they're biting, or it's a really big challenging behaviour, is trying to think, what's the emotion behind that behaviour? What's that child trying to communicate to us? And then recognise that emotion as an opportunity for intimacy and teaching. So not only have we recognised that there's emotion going on, but we think actually now is a moment that we can sort of try and support this child to learn, develop and grow. And those first 2 steps might involve labelling the child's feelings as well and helping them recognise those things. Or I'm jumping ahead a little bit for myself, but often that's the bit that I start with, is labelling and sort of saying what's going on, or out loud wondering what's going on, so that the child starts to become aware and recognises that you're becoming aware of what's going on for them. If the child is able to communicate their feelings, we should be listening empathetically and validating those feelings. In those instances, often I use language like, I think you're feeling very sad, or I'm wondering if you're feeling very sad right now. So you're recognizing the emotion, you're identifying it for them. And then if the child isn't able to communicate, just validating that feeling for them. So it's okay to feel sad. Everyone feels sad sometimes. And just giving them that understanding that all the emotions we experience are absolutely fine. That it's okay to have the feeling. It's the behaviour that isn't always desirable, but it's not the feeling. So we need to be there validating that for them. And then we can help the child to label that emotion. I flip those things around, but I don't think that matters too much. And then our final step is setting limits. So we need to have connected with that emotion and help that child to feel like we are understanding that emotion for them before we set limits. So once you've acknowledged the emotion, you can then say it's okay to feel sad, but it's not okay to hit or bite or throw something. And so you're setting your limit really clearly. And then I would always give strategies or options for strategies to help them solve the problem, especially in early years. So instead of hitting, we can, and then whatever options are available to that child, we can sit together and calm down, or we can take a walk outside, or we can look at a storybook, or we can go to our calm down corner. Whatever that might be for that child, we can think about and try and adapt. But the idea is you're listening empathetically, labeling the emotion, setting the limits, and then exploring the problem. And all these things can happen in like a really clear script. And when I've done it before in settings myself, I have actually written the script, and we have all shared the script and used the same script. And that way it's really nice and consistent, so that the child starts to have that predictability of how you're going to respond. The length of that script probably depends on that child's understanding, age, and language ability. So I would often say things along the lines of, I can see you're feeling really sad right now, or I wonder if you're feeling sad right now. It's okay to feel sad. We all feel sad sometimes, but it's not okay to hit. So instead, we can calm down in our calm down corner or have a cuddle. And then you're giving that whole framework in a really nice, sort of concise few words. And if the child continues with the behaviour, I would just revisit those things. I know you're feeling sad, but we cannot hit. We need to take some time out. Either we can sit down in the calm down corner, or we can have a cuddle. And you just re-emphasising that point. As I said, I'm not expecting that to work wonders instantly. It takes time for children to get used to those approaches. But over time, it can be really impactful and helpful. So that's emotion coaching. Again, I've put some links in the end with the resources that has more information about that approach if it's something you're interested in finding out more about. And then my final things, I'm going to whistle through these bits at the end, about what we can do for children who need even more support to calm. So we've tried our emotion coaching, and we've done all of our resiliency strategies to try and boost those protective factors. But in that very much peak and that top of the curve, we are still struggling to get them to calm all the way down. And whatever we think about when we're thinking about developing calming strategies, I would try and revisit some of those psychology principles. And I appreciate I do that because I'm a psychologist, but I would encourage everyone to do the same and think about those underlying needs and how we can use those sort of protective factors within the strategies that we're putting in place. So what can we do to give that child a sense of control? What can we do to build on their interests? What can we do to show that we have a supportive and caring relationship? And what skills does that child need support with? And we can do all of those in our calming down activities, as well as throughout our days in preschool or earlier settings. So we can think about that when we're developing strategies such as our calm down box. So calm down boxes, I know, are really well understood strategies. I'm not trying to suggest something new here, but what I'm trying to suggest is that we think about it for that individual child. So we think about whether they can be involved in the creation, so they've got more autonomy, whether we can include activities that relate to their interests, whether we can think about different strategies that offer calming techniques, because maybe that's the skill they need to learn. And then we can think about whether they need to do that on their own or whether they would prefer that adult reassurance with them there, and what's important for them in those moments of bonding. And perhaps sometimes if children are unfamiliar with calm down boxes or calm down activities, we need to practice, and we need to practice using them when they're already calm so that they can become aware of those skills and develop what they need. So some of the things that we can think about putting in that box. So when I talk about, oh, I can hear myself all of a sudden. Can I just ask everyone checks that they're on mute? There, are you able to check that for me? Super, thank you. Can't stand it when I get an echo. It's so hard to focus. Yeah, so when we think about that calm down box, there's so many things we can.
Dulcie, you're now on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Absolutely, sorry. Completely unaware, so thank you, Sarah. So I will go back a little bit, but when we think about what goes into our calm down boxes, there are so many things we can include. So these ideas are just here to sort of, I guess, help us think outside the box a little bit. Often people do similar things, sort of some of those sensory toys, fiddle toys, or light up toys, but there is a whole range of things we can consider, and that will very much depend on our individual children. So these are just here as ideas. And then on my next slide, I'm going to whistle through this last bit, but about creating a calm down space. Again, I'm not suggesting anything new, but what I'm suggesting is that we go back to those resiliency and protective factors and think about how we can use those when creating these strategies and when we're putting them in place. So what can we do to involve the child in the creation of the space? Can we allow them to use that space autonomously? Do they need support to co-regulate and calm? Perhaps they need that adult bonding in that moment. Or are there things we can do to personalize it for them or incorporate their interests so that it's meaningful to them? All of those things and those considerations, when we put strategies in place, help to bring up those protective factors and put more of those protective elements in place for children. So even in the strategies we use every day, we can try and build those protective factors. And my final thing is about taking care of the caretaker. Resilience theory also relates to adults. It's a universal theory that works for all of us. So please do take time to consider your own needs. It's really tricky when we're working with children with SCMH needs, and those big behaviours can be really challenging to manage. So I always recommend, where possible, avoiding one person being one-to-one all day, but using a team approach instead, so that children develop relationships with more people, which is a really positive thing, but also adults get a chance to have a breather and a break, because it can be hugely exhausting. And by all means, use the resilience ball and think about some of those protective factors that you might need to be in place when you're at work managing some of those tricky dynamics. I'm nearly at the end of all my talking, and I will leave some space for questions. But my few final reminders at the end are, it's not always about coming up with unique strategies, but thinking about how we can personalise strategies to make sure they're right for that child. Bespoke strategies are really important. It can take time for strategies to embed and be effective. I would recommend one strategy is tried for 6 weeks as a minimum. And if children are only attending settings for sort of 1 day a week or a couple of days a week, I would recommend potentially even longer than 6 weeks. So whilst I recognise it's not helpful when you want immediate and impactful change. Sometimes it does take children a long time to get on board with those strategies and to get on board with the change we're trying to create. So do bear with them. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not working. Always monitor and celebrate the small steps of progress. Learning emotional regulation skills is really hard. And for children in the early years, it's a skill we don't expect them to have developed yet fully. So we're trying to get them to do something that's really tricky. And it's especially tricky for children who have a high number of risk factors. So recognizing those small steps of progress is great for the children, but it's also great for the staff, and it helps you feel like you're actually seeing progress. And then my final reminder is that equity isn't the same as equality. So some children will need more protective factors being put in place at school or preschool. They will need more support in their preschool settings, but that doesn't mean that they're getting more than their peers. It just means that we're trying to balance those weighing scales so that their protective factors equal out against the risk factors that they've experienced. Okay. So there's a list of resources that I've popped up here. I will share the slides so you can have a look at them on your own. And then I've got a final question for reflections, and then I'm going to flick to my final slide so that you can see it before I go to reflections, because my colleague has helpfully developed a QR code for me. But if you have the chance to fill in our questionnaire, we would greatly appreciate it. It's just a really quick evaluation form. This one is for the Educational Psychology Service. I think sometimes the SASI sort of training sessions also have their own, but it is, and I appreciate everyone always hates filling out an evaluation form, but the impact for us is huge because it means that we're able to keep doing things like this. So if you have a minute to do it, I would be grateful. I will share the link in the chat as well. Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing and ask, is there any questions, or are there any final reflections or things that you're going to take away from this training? So if you don't have a question, is there one thing that you've learned today that you think this is something I'm going to take away and use in practice? Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button to stop sharing. Now I've confused myself. Have I stopped sharing? Yeah, super. That's really confused myself then. I'd like to say thank you, Emily. You're absolutely amazing at going first on these things, so I really appreciate it. I'd like to use the Headspace time with staff where they can be covered to take 10 minutes away after a tricky situation. Absolutely. The impact on our own emotional well-being is huge, and it's so important to give ourselves a chance to recover when those big outbursts happen. Calm down boxes, emotion coaching. Kirsty, the emotion coaching website, I've signposted to on my slides, but they have videos available explaining everything about their approach for practitioners. They're really short as well, so really useful. Everyone's talking about emotion coaching, so I'm glad that's impactful. I talk about it all the time. Calm down boxes for more children, emotion coaching, so popular, emotion coaching. I'm not sure if it's something you do, but a few of our staff team attended Western University, and I think similar training sessions for a uni class would be really amazing. Do you know what? It's not something I do, but I agree it would be amazing if we could do that. If anyone has connections and has recommendations of how we could get in touch with that, we'd love to do it. We're always trying to build more connections with our post-16 networks and our post-16 providers. Staff training event, identify young people's behaviours. Yeah, absolutely. Found it really interesting. It makes so much sense. Oh, thanks. It's really helpful to have your feedback. Like I said, I'm going to put the evaluation form in the chat, but even if just a couple of you fill it in, I am always grateful. Yeah, 5 to Thrive, Caroline, is a great strategy and really good one to be thinking about for these sorts of children. I honestly can't keep up with the amount of messages coming in right now. So I apologise if I miss everything that you're saying. By all means, if you've got questions, you can ask them out loud. You don't have to put them in the chat if you'd prefer to speak. And I have finished, so if you want to go, you can go and enjoy your evenings, because it is late. And I am grateful that everyone's managed to stay online for so long.
Dulcie, can I just say a very big thank you from the early years team. Thank you to all of you for attending after such a long day at work. We really do appreciate it. And the volume of people was huge. So thank you very much. And for anybody that's interested, we are taking this not this particular training, but we have the nurture pack now that we have in North Somerset, and Sarah Long and myself will be running face-to-face training where you can bring a child in mind, write a nurture pack and take it away to use in your setting. And the date for that is Wednesday, April the 17th. And you can sign on online on the North Somerset online CPD. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evenings and keep warm.
Thank you.
So many people to thank and say goodbye to, isn't it? Sarah, did you see what the number of people was when it was at its busiest?
49.
49.
It's 49.
I've got to go back to PIP this week and evidence all the early years work that I do, so it's good to have a big number.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Do you have a time for the nurture pack training, please?
Yes, it is 9:30 to 11:30 or 6:30 to 8:30.
Thank you very much. That's a long old day for you too. Are you going to have a break in the middle?
Might find half an hour somewhere. Yeah, I'm sure we will, Maria. I'm sure we will.
How many of the evening trainings do you guys do?
It varies, to be honest, and it depends what we're doing. For example, I'm just, because it actually suits me to do some evenings, I'm doing one tomorrow as well.